really excited. This is the first of a new series of our captivating conversations. On the 4th of the month, I'm going to be in conversation with someone from our Leo Baeck Temple community. And then on the 2nd of the month, on every Thursday from 4 to 5 p.m., Rabbi Ross is going to be in conversation with someone from outside of our community. So hopefully we'll get to learn from a variety of people and voices. And I have to say, I am so excited that we're going to be in conversation today with Josh Strok, who is a beloved member of our LBT community. He's on our board, he's on our executive committee, and he's going to be sharing with us a little bit about himself today, and also in his role outside of Leo Baeck in the world, exploring what is the changing nature of work. We know that already this was an important topic with the digitization and all of the changing trends that have been happening, but then obviously how the pandemic has exacerbated what work looks like today. And Josh is going to share with us a little bit about what it may look like going into the future and some of the trends that he's noticed in his work. And so first, Josh, before we kind of jump into our conversation, I wonder if you, first of all, why don't you say a little bit about what it is that you do? Because I will say, whenever I hear someone talk about being in human resources, I always want to know, what does that actually mean and look like? So maybe will you sort of tell us the secret of what that is?
Sure. I'm happy to, and thank you for inviting me. I'm happy to be here. So my role really is in management consulting to HR organizations. So it's not as though I'm in human resources for my company. I work largely in partnership with HR departments for large, typically medium and large sized for-profit, not-for-profit organizations, helping them deal with their whole range of, what do we pay people? Who should we be thinking about? What are the skills we need? Where do we find people? We don't do recruiting ourselves, but compensation, benefits, the whole sort of gamut of those kinds of topics. And so I lead a team of very smart people who do these kinds of pieces. And my team is sort of from the Western US. In our definition, that means sort of Texas and points west. So.
All right. And how did you get into this work? Was this something you knew that you wanted to do? Did this happen by accident? What kind of drove you into this?
I would say a series of happy accidents. So I went into college thinking I was going to be a neurobiologist, neuropsychology kinds of pieces. Organic chemistry did what it's supposed to do and realized that I was not in the right field of study, and swapped psychology and chemistry. And my parents' next door neighbor at the time was a VP of human resources for our organization. And I, had been doing all sorts of stuff and babysitting and cleaning her house. And she said, and I said, I'm trying to figure out like what's next. I've gone through this sort of major change. And she said, my boss needs a summer intern. Why don't you come apply? And that led me into the first piece of getting into actually an HR organization, and did that kind of work for 5 years. And then was getting my MBA and decided I ought to get consulting on my resume and I thought for like I'd survive for 2 or 3 years. And 20 plus years later, I'm still doing this consulting kind of work.
Wow. Okay. Well, and I guess as a member of the LBT community, what brought you and Karen and later the boys into being a part of it, and kind of, I guess, what keeps you here? What about being in this community, really draws you here or inspires you to be in it, especially in the role that you're in?
So what brought us here was, I'd say, really 3 things. So we had hopped around various Reform synagogues. My wife is a Reform rabbi.
Very
and
awesome, amazing, wonderful one, Rabbi Karen Strok.
Completely agree. And luckily for me, I think doesn't have a typical pulpit role. So we've been able to be in parts, and our boys were young and we were looking for an alternative way for Sunday school. And at the time, Leo Baeck Temple had something that was met our needs, and we fell. And so that was great. We also came to the Purim spiel, and there was something else, and I'm blanking on what it was, but like we fell in love with the community, right? It was like any place that can
Was it the
laugh at
community
itself.
retreat?
I think it was the community retreat, exactly. So like the perm spiel, that any place that can laugh at itself, right? Make fun and have music and just the whole community being part of it. And the community retreat of being such a warm, welcoming place. Bringing in the new family and strangers and making you feel at home was amazing. And so and that's part of like, yes, we all have crazy and busy jobs, but the reason I choose Leo Baeck Temple as a place to dedicate more of my time to is that I get so much out of this community that I want to make sure we are continuing to evolve it and meet and welcome new people in and make it the kind of place that we all want to be affiliated with.
Awesome. Well, thank you for the contributions that you have. Karen Wagner saying we need more Purim spiels. Yes. Agreed. Josh, I wonder if you can, give a little bit of a background or landscape for us in terms of how are you thinking about or understanding what this whole field of work looks like, and what are some of the big questions that you've been hearing, in your work?
Sure. I'm happy to. So, a lot of what we do for organizations is helping them think about, well, what are their jobs? Well, what's the work that goes on? How do they construct work? How do they find the right people and the right jobs with the right skills and pay them the right amounts from pay? And how do they have appropriate benefit programs? And we've done that for many, many years. And before the pandemic, lots of that, AI, the conversations about what gets automated and how is AI changing the nature of work, and even conversations around diversity and inclusion and pay fairness and pay equity, and the move or conversations about stakeholder capitalism versus shareholder capitalism and what's the right balance and all of that stuff. And what I would say is the pandemic definitely accelerated those conversations. So organizations that were already, that had thought we're an in-person kind of organization and we need to do everything in person, bumped up against the fact that for health reasons and lots of other very good reasons, not doing that was optional and actually effective for them. And organizations that were already used to sort of more flexible ways of working accelerated those conversations, but similarly had very big challenges. So every places from like Starbucks or health system, right, or hospital systems that deliver what they need. There is a clear physicality to what they do and how they serve in the community, to organizations like Facebook and Twitter and any of the very digital enabled organizations, similarly all asking very similar kinds of conversations around what is this, what do we do, how do we do, what is our culture, what does it mean to have a job anymore? Like some really sort of very fundamental conversations that have been coming up.
Wow. What are some of the trends that you've noticed since the pandemic that you think are sort of here to stay, versus, some of the things that you think will continue to change or might go back, to this whole idea we've been saying, like when things go back to normal, what is that? What does that even look like? What do you think is going to be that new normal, or, the post-pandemic world with regard to work?
So I think, so my own point of view, and I'd say what we think as an organization and the company I work with, which is, I should probably say, is Willis Towers Watson, is organizations need to create a new capability, right, to sort of balance competing, what may at times feel like competing needs of what their talent is, right? Who they're, and I use the word talent intentionally. So both employees, but also the people who are helping them get work done that may not be directly their employees. So people like myself as consultants, or gig worker, right? People who just do gig kinds of stuff, or automation and all sorts of ways of getting work done. Balancing am I getting paid appropriately, competitively in the marketplace? Is it fair? Why do I want to come to work? How do I grow my career? Is it do I get to see people? Do I get to have the culture I like to work in? All of those very interesting, like person-driven, human-centric driven kinds of conversations against organizations need at some level to balance their budgets, right? If you're in for-profit or not for-profit, you have to balance your budget. You have to meet regulatory requirements. You have other stakeholders that are at, right? Whether that's governments or your investors or your employees or all sorts of, you've got many stakeholders that are pushing on you. You have questions around just fairness kinds of conversations. And a big conversation that's come up is both, how do I get what I do done, right? Starbucks, how do I get coffee into people's hands, right? If that's not so safe anymore, we have to think about those kinds of pieces. Or, or even, how do I get the new version of whatever, let's call it Facebook? How do I get the new app developed? And this idea of creation and collaboration and innovation, how do we balance those conversations if the only way we interact is only by screen? There is a cultural conversation that many leaders have come into asking about, how do we drive performance, not necessarily just in the next 3 months or 6 months or 12 months, but the long-term value of who we are and who we're going to be. How do we plant the seeds of that today?
Interesting. It's funny because before everyone came on, you and I were just talking and about, how we present ourselves on our Zoom, right? In the background, you might hear my husband who's right on the other side of this door. And I was saying, you may see my child who kind of pops in and you'll see her little curls and emerge. And, you were talking about sort of the ways that your family also, comes into your room. And I just wonder, I think a question we've all been really grappling with is, what does productivity look like in this moment? And, has productivity taken a dive with an increase of people working from home? And, what are the measurements that you all use to really evaluate what a successful environment looks like, and how you even understand what productivity is?
So, I mean, there's some, depending on the business, there are some obvious ways you can measure productivity in terms of output, whatever, is that number of applications, is that number of products sold in a store, is that number of patients handled? So generally what we've seen is productivity has actually stayed the same or actually gotten better in 2020. That this degree of flexibility has actually freed people up. So think about all of us who live here in Southern California. I don't have to drive to a train station, get on a train to go into downtown, walk to my building, go up an elevator, and then start my work. Granted, I've got my electronic device that lets me work in some portions and parts of that, but that commute time is now used differently, right? So either my wife would say, I start my workday immediately. I roll out of bed and my workday has started. I don't have a commute time anymore. So that level of productivity has gotten better. Or on all the days I used to travel to all the different wherever in the world I was going, sitting in TSA lines and waiting for cabs and doing all the other things that I used to do don't happen anymore. So now, do I miss the physical interaction with human beings? And is there something? Absolutely, I do. Luckily my 2 teenage kids are probably like, I miss you seeing other human beings as well. But I think that balance of productivity is there. The real question is that cultural sense of well-being. What have I lost from my physical safety is probably okay, right? From reducing that exposure, but am I being as physically healthy about, am I eating as well as I might have been doing otherwise? Am I getting the physical exercise I might have? The emotion, do I have all the emotional regulation, right? All the stress of a lot of the research we've done would say that, and Lisa, you and I were talking about this, and so I'll use you as a great example of a working mother, right? You were already balancing children in preschool and a working husband, and where do you need to be, and all the different places you're going. As you just said, your daughters are there with you, right? And so in some levels that's great, right? You can have lunch with your daughters and all those things. and it comes at trade-offs. And what we'd say is women are finding this flexibility more helpful to their balance and their sense of engagement and productivity. Men and so this is a stereotypical gender sexist kind of conversation, but in our research, more men are coming up and saying, being home is really hard. This isn't the deal I signed up for. Like, that was her deal. Let me out, get me back to the office. Like, I want to go back now. And it's interesting also because that, if you think about the leadership in many of our organizations are still predominantly men, that culture is coming forward to say, get us back into the office. We want to be back in the office as a culture of leaders. And so challenging that and saying, well, wait a minute, is that what everybody really wants? Is that what's really best for your whole organization? There's a lot of that trade-off of what does productivity look like? And it may be you may feel more productive, but does everybody feel more productive if it's an in-person culture work experience?
Got it. So fascinating. Is that sort of the main conversation? Is it, how do we get back to being in person? I mean, do you feel like that's sort of the overriding hope, or is it, I mean, I was talking to someone in our community who was saying they're not sure if they're going to have an office anymore. And that they might shift their whole, working environment to being at home, and it's more cost efficient, and they've seen that it works. And so, is this what you're understanding as returning to the office? Is that the, leading question?
I think the leading question is what is being together? What's the value of being together? What do we accomplish when we're physically together? And what is the purpose of that? Because we can theoretically, we could all reduce real estate costs and technology and some technology costs, right, by staying virtual. But what do we give up, right? Everything is a trade-off in life. Like my father's, the thing I've learned from one of the many, many things I've learned from my father is you give up some things and you get others, right? And everything is this trade-off of what are you willing to give up? We're willing to be virtual to save on all these commute times and real estate costs and all these other and carbon emissions and all sorts of other really important things that people that come into these conversations. But do we lose the human interaction? Do we lose the who we are, right? I mean, a lot of the conversation I have within my own organization is I don't want people to feel like they're independent consultants that just have my brand on their business card. I want them to feel part of my company, part of my team. And I worry about the newest people we're hiring in who have only ever seen me by screen. How connected to me do they really feel? How connected to the larger team do they really feel if they don't have any of that team building conversations? And we've done virtual happy hours and we've done all, scavenger hunts and all sorts of, trying to recreate some of these conversations. But there is something that you give up by not being physically together. And so what I would say is many organizations are rethinking space, right? Rethinking why we come together, and having floors of cubicles, right, is probably going away. They're probably going to turn into much more open space, creative space, team orientation, because does it make sense for me to drive into an office and spend 8 hours typing at a keyboard by myself? Probably not, right? Does it make sense for me to come in and have creative conversations and say, well, what are you working on and what am I working on and how does we make that stuff make 1 + 1 = 3? That's what's more interesting to organizations trying to figure this stuff out. But again, a hospital can do only so much of that stuff, right? There's some things that they need physicality to. Starbucks still needs someone to brew coffee and hand it to you. But there's some pieces where they don't need to be together, and trying to think creatively about telehealth and where does a doctor be able to do things not where you're physically there, and where can a pharmacist do things right remotely. And so there's a lot of creativity around the physicality in space as well.
As you're saying that, Josh, it's interesting because I feel a tension there, and that in some ways I feel like we know each other maybe more, not more, but in a different way. And just that there's maybe a vulnerability that gets exposed when we're on Zoom. Part of it is what we described, that we are at home in our space. And that we do have our family or our dogs or whatever it is, we're not, suited up into our fancy clothes. We're like wearing leggings and, slippers or whatever works for you. Right. And so I feel like in some ways, I've at least found that I've had more real conversations with people and that I've been willing to be more, real with who I am in a way that I wasn't necessarily in the office, partly because also the world, I think, dictated that that's not how we engage with one another in the office. So like that's on the one hand, I'm wondering how you experience that and if that's a trend you think will continue in person. And on the other hand, I'm also thinking of, all the Jewish theologians who would argue, right, that there is something about being in person and that we feel bound to one another when we do see each other's face,
Yeah.
literally, right, and sort of the essence of God behind that face, and how we don't even necessarily, some of us very much know we're missing that, and others of us are so used to what this new world is, we forget that. And so, like, I'm just thinking about how you negotiate that tension.
I think I think it is so this is also, that tension exists in many dimensions. So as an example, I find that we can be less formal in these settings, but they're also very constructed, right? We scheduled this time to have this conversation. We didn't just I didn't happen to be at the temple and you happened to be at the temple and we happened to interact with each other and have a sidebar conversation. So those accidental collision conversations aren't really happening anymore. And there's something very much lost in those impromptu interactions. Now, at the same time, it takes thought, and we can say, you know what, Lisa, I want to talk with you. Let's go schedule next week 15 minutes and just can we create those impromptu conversations? We can, but you have to be intentional about it versus sort of the accidental pieces. And there is something important about those unplanned interactions for human connectivity that I think is that we are missing in this, and that is very tough to recreate in these kinds of levels. And at the same time, that joking about, like, there's the Zoom bingo about, okay, whose cat showed up, whose dog showed up, whose kid showed up, whose husband walked by in the back of the room, like all of those exist, right? Like, and we've become much more tolerant, at least in the professional working world, of all of that stuff happening, of like, crap, Zoom crashed yet again, or I can't, like, mute, right? We all joke about, well, who's on mute and you're talking on mute, and all, like, that doesn't happen in person, like, or if it does, something's really wrong. So some degree of grace has also entered the work world of like being flexible and being okay with people, like, and I will say more, I don't know, 60-70% of the people that work on my team are women. And so there was also an interesting cultural phenomenon or shift that, like, 2 years ago, when we would all try and have video conversations, almost no woman would turn on her camera, right? Because if she was working from home, she was not in professional garb, right? She hadn't put on her face of makeup and combed her hair and blah, blah, blah. This year, this past 2020, I saw, everyone had to have their cameras on, and women became much more comfortable saying, like, this is who I'm at. Like, now, did they just literally roll out of bed and show up to a meeting? Probably not, right? But were they made up as they used to be in professional garb? No, they absolutely weren't as well. So there's some cultural acceptance of those kinds of pieces that was happening along the same line. So I think it's going to be this interesting shift of where does work go, and what are the cultural and leadership implications of that? Like, what's the model? And at least I'd bring up to this, like, students, right? Like, we ask students to be on camera all the time now. How good, at some level, you want to know they're engaged and interacting, and there's very good reasons. And at the same time, they're looking at themselves all the time, right? Versus being interacting, and what's the implications of someone always seeing themselves? Like, how much more narcissistic do we need to be about always looking at ourselves in this culture and those kinds of conversations? So there are no easy, like, everything is a trade-off, and some of these things we're just realizing some of the implications or some of those questions to be asking as we're working through more of the the process.
Josh, are you seeing new leadership models emerge as a result of this? How are leaders being trained differently? Should they be trained differently? Is there more shared leadership happening? Is, it still is hierarchical? Like, sort of, what are the implications on that end?
So from a leadership model, I do think it's industry to some degree. It's what is the nature of work that you're trying to accomplish, and what's the business structure that you're in, and those things definitely dictate this. Although I'll say the interesting piece is what is the culture, what are the values of the institution that we're talking about, and who gets to set those values, right, tends to come from leaders. And so thinking about, well, who are those leaders? How do we set institutional values and hold ourselves accountable to those? And who are the stakeholders that get to shape and influence what those value systems are and should look like, are also definitely part of this conversation. So leaders are definitely much more in focus about driving these kinds of conversations, because there is a huge inflection point about what kind of culture, what kind of business do we want to be? And therefore, who are the people making those decisions, and what's the imprint on the organizations that they have? Leading to then, well, okay, how do we survive this moment, and what does the leadership start to look like? But then what do we think the next sets of skills and capabilities? Like, do we need to be much better at telepresenting? Like, it's no longer standing in front of a room of 500 people to be a leader, right? I need to learn from the people on television, right? How they stare into a screen and look engaged and happy and all of those things, versus looking engaged and happy to a room of 500 people. Those are very different skill sets. And so the question is, which one? Maybe you need both, but those are the open conversations that are still happening.
Yeah, that was my next question, which was like, thinking of sort of this next generation who will emerge into this unknown field, right? Of probably more, flexible hours, or maybe a hybrid of in-person, and all of these changes that we're all, continuing to adapt to, and that are changing at rates that are, really moving so fast that it's almost, very, very difficult to catch up to. What are some of the skills or tools that you think are essential on the organizational side that they need to be training their employees in, and on the other hand, in terms of people who are entering the workforce, what are some of the things that you think they should be thinking about, or want to change the field that they're in? Like, what are some of the things you think they're going to be needing?
So again, I'm going to speak in really broad terms.
Exactly. You can bring us into as
well, because some of these are going to depend, am I talking about financial services or healthcare, or right, et cetera, et cetera. But broadly speaking, the things we would say that are growing and increasing value and importance are things like communication, right? Your ability to effectively understand and communicate is critical, whether that is in a verbal mode, a written mode, right? Thinking about, and particularly for leaders, look, I'm a person who gets way too many emails. And so if my leadership is trying to communicate in a very long email, I'll use this acronym that I only learned a couple years ago, this TLDR, right? Too long, didn't read. Like, so it's the Twitter evaluation of like, and so clients have come to us and said, like, you wrote me a 30-page PowerPoint presentation. I've got no time for 30 pages. Like, it better be 3 pages and I'm done, right? Like,
hey, Josh, I just have to say, I'm internalizing this again. Too long, didn't read. I feel like this is gonna have to be a whole training for rabbis, right? Because we're, known for being overly verbose, right? Or being verbose. So yes.
But it's taking that, right? So, but that's a model. Like, are people willing to go sit on a screen, right? We talked about Zoom fatigue, right? Like, this is at best an hour. Could I go have a 4-hour conversation about this? Of course we could, but would we? That may not be such a great idea, right? And so how do you effectively communicate? Do you do podcasts? Do you do little, 30-second video snips that you're able to send out? Like, thinking creatively about how you get there, which also builds to this digital capability, right? How am I effective and efficient at using new digital tools, whatever those might be, to get what I want done. It's right. It's not that I'm asking everyone to be the next coder, right? A software, high-level software engineer. But if I don't know how to use Zoom or Teams or Google Meets or whatever the platform people are using is, I'm going to get left behind, because that is just where we are, right? That is where work is getting done and where conversations are happening, right? And so like my kids continue to make fun of me. Like, I am not a Facebook, Instagram maven by any stretch of the imagination. But I'm okay, but like, it's not the place where I'm confident in doing stuff. And so Avi makes legitimately and for good reason makes fun of me on those things. And so getting that last piece. I think the last one I would highlight is emotional intelligence, right? Knowing and being able to read yourself and others to figure out where you are and what is needed to help make people effective in whatever it is you're asking to do. Not just raw intelligence, but particularly that emotional intelligence of understanding the human aspect of getting stuff done, because we are well past the day of being able to just to say to someone, sit here and do this for X amount of time and just do it and do it and do it. There's too many choices of jobs at the moment. And you can argue those things, right, about gig work and the stability of work, and there's very valuable conversations there, but there are way too many choices these days for our workforce to have options, particularly here in North America, that just to sort of say do this or else, the or else has way too many attractive pieces. And so having that emotional intelligence to motivate people has become a critical factor.
I'm intrigued by that in particular. I am a millennial, and in the workforce, that's often considered not a good asset, right? Millennials are known generally broadly speaking, as being, lazy or entitled or all those things. And yet I also notice a little bit in terms of what you're saying, that there's an aspect, again, overgeneralizing, right? But that there's also an aspect of millennials where it's like, actually, I'm looking for a certain quality of life, and I'm not willing to, work to live, right? Obviously, that's a component that we need to survive, but I want to do something meaningful. And so I'm willing to sort of like figure that out and do a bunch of different jobs. And I'm just wondering if that, is playing into this, and has
Hugely.
and where does the pandemic fit with regard to that
So I'd
aspect?
say one of the very big macro themes that have come up, that has been reinforced. It was always a big thing, but it's become even more, is this holistic conversation about well-being. So that, and when I use the word well-being, I don't mean just, so we would take its physical well-being, it's your emotional well-being, it's your financial well-being, and it's your social well-being, like all of that intertwined together. And so a couple things I'd say just specifically about millennials. Millennials now are the workforce, right? They are the largest generation, and they are in leadership roles, right? They aren't just the kids anymore, right? Those darn kids. Like, these are the leaders making these decisions now. They are the managers, the leaders, the CEOs, the CFOs. So that is the group who are trying to figure out, like, I don't want to be just a worker, right? I want this holistic sense of well-being. To how do I have my kids and go to yoga and do whatever, right? All of those balanced things, and have a career and get paid a good amount of money and contribute and not destroy the earth and right? And so there's this balancing conversation, again, coming back to these trade-offs. Like, this is what everyone is trying to figure out, is what are the trade-offs, and where's that balance point, and what are your trade-offs? What are you willing to trade off at this point in time? And what am I willing to trade off? And let's also be fair, that let's not assume that, like, when you made the choice of whatever your trade-offs are today, I shouldn't assume that is static forever, right? That your trade-offs will evolve as relationships change, children change, jobs change, all that, political environments, regulatory environments, all of those things are going to shift around us. And therefore, constantly being in conversation about those things is what becomes a more critical capability.
Hmm. So I want to make sure we'll have some time to open up for conversation, but a question that I am also thinking about is, sort of this piece you mentioned of diversity and inclusion. I was listening to a podcast the other day with Melinda Gates, and she was talking about how women will, I hope I don't mess up this statistic, but she was saying that women will find equality based on this whole metric that they've established, that women will actually be equal to men in 208 years. 208 years, which that was shocking and a little devastating. And, also thinking about with the high levels of unemployment, and we all know with the pandemic, the amount of women that have left the workforce, and in particular women of color, and just how much this is pushing back, women in employment for so many years to come. And so I'm just wondering how you're seeing that in the worlds that you live in, and how we as a society navigate that and come back from that.
Those are they are. It's this interesting conversation. So we as an organization definitely grapple with these kinds of conversations and help our partner organizations grapple with them. And a lot of it is coming to what is fair pay, right? So some of that conversation is about representation at levels, right? That we talked about the men making many of these leadership decisions. How do we get more women into leadership decisions? How do we get more representation, not just gender, but on all the various aspects of inclusion and diversity, and so that people making those decisions have a different point of view, right? That when I'm in a room that doesn't look only like me, I now get to grapple with, oh, your experience is different than my experience. What does that mean? How do we engender more of that? If that's the workforce we need and want going forward. There's a lot of the conversation around like living wage, right? So this conversation and what are the benefit systems, and and think about in California about like the propositions about, and I'm not going to make a political statement here, but like with our Uber and Lyft drivers, employees or non-employees, right? And the implications of that, and the conversations around, well, where are benefits, healthcare benefits and retirement benefits connected to work, or are they more social constructs that we as a society want to engender? And what are the implications of cost and affordability, and all of those kinds of conversations are definitely coming up in these conversations. And because they're all very much connected about the people most impacted are the ones most at the lowest levels in terms of earnings and job stability and all those other conversations. What are we trying to solve for in those places? And in fairness, they are also often those jobs that are the most at risk from automation, right? That are the easiest to solve for in routine, repetitive kinds of work that a machine is by and large better at doing than a human being. And so it becomes a very complicated, values-oriented conversation. And what I'd say, just for me as a Jew doing this kind of work, is it is a challenge for me to figure out where is my personal value system front and center and informing who I am and how I operate in the world, compared to the organization I sit in and the value system of the consulting organization that I sit within, compared to the value system of the client I'm interacting with. And where does the world, according to Josh, have value? It has value, but where and when does that come to the fore? And where does it come to the fore when I'm just in personal conversations and my how I vote and where I spend my money and all those kinds of pieces, versus how I help organizations think about just what to pay people and how to construct jobs? It has to be both, but I'll say it is an ongoing conversation in my head and with my wife that I don't know that there are any simple answers to.
That makes sense. Yeah, I want to open it up for anyone who has a question.
I do.
Want to ask. Go ahead, Pearl.
Oh, are you talking to me?
Yeah, you go ahead.
Oh, okay. I wanted to your conversation stirred up a lot of thoughts in me, and it made me go back to a book I read many years ago by Ashley Montague, a what was he, an anthropologist, in which he raised the idea of women and men sharing the same job, that 4 hours and 4 hours or 5 hours and 5 hours. Is it, do you see that as a possibility? Is robotry going to get in the way of that? Or uh, that's one idea that the other idea is, which type of work alienates people more from each other? This one, or when you're in the office, and if you're still just at your cubicle in your office, that still is an alienation in a way, but you do have a chance to intermingle. And I was just thinking of the shared opportunities to do all the things you wanted to say, go to the gym, do yoga, take care of your kids, and do your work in a constructive way. Oh, the other thought I come is your morality. When you're talking about your Jewish values and how do they dovetail with the clients you have and with what information you have to share with them and so forth. It's a very, very layered and complicated way of thinking about it. So that's my question about the shared, especially the shared opportunities.
Yeah, I mean, so job sharing exists, right? I don't think it exists. So it exists. I don't think it's done nearly enough. I think it tends to be an efficiency question around how do you do knowledge, like what did Lisa do for the first 4 hours? What do I need to do for the next 4 hours? There becomes a lot of those kinds of, and what jobs really lend themselves to sort of that kind of sharing. I think what we've tried to do more so than job share is really to say, how do we break down and do a lot of like unconscious bias training and sort of lots of the other pieces to say, why do we think of nurses as a woman's job, right? Like, what is it about that role? Like, what are we doing? And, those kinds of conversations, and how do we intentionally go recruit for diversity into these kinds of roles and make sure that what we're paying isn't only so that the only people who can do that are second earners, right? Like there's a lot of conversation, is this a first earner job or is this a second earner job? Meaning, and so I think to that, I think it's a complicated conversation. It's also one that technology gets into the mix about, like, I think people are sharing their jobs with a computer now, not with another human being, right? How much of this gets done by automation versus by another human being is a more of a larger trend. To the trade-off of what's more alienating, I think that there's a lot of personal psychology to that. Am I an introvert that would love to be sort of in the office by myself, put my headphones on and just clack away at my keyboard? There are lots of people who work for me that love that kind of interaction and hate constantly needing to be on the screen with somebody. There are other people who are, and I'm grossly oversimplifying, the extroverts are like, I'm dying for more interaction, and this screen thing just like isn't it? I'd also say one of my colleagues who's been doing this work for longer than I have said, I hate my work right now. I miss going to lunch with clients. I miss having the 5-minute, seeing people's offices and their family photos and their knickknacks and like the things that made them human to me. That's what I love. Like, the work is the work, but like the other things are what I love. I miss all of that humanistic pieces that go on.
So interesting. Okay. Any other questions anyone wants to raise? Yeah, go ahead. I see Libby and then Mike.
I was wondering about the concept of compensation being tied to location. That people that work in more expensive cities, and if they're working remotely, what that does to their pay.
That is the biggest question I'm dealing with my clients right now. So particularly living here in an expensive, or San Francisco, right? And we can all read the various articles of people leaving expensive areas and going somewhere else. I boil it down to 3 answers. One, we need to be careful about the permanence of that move, right? So I go back to Y2K, and we built all of these solutions so that when Y2K was going to happen, all of this was going to happen, nothing really happened, and all these people we paid a lot of money to suddenly became not really all that important anymore, right? And then there's a lot of internal disequity and all sorts of problems. So we need to be careful about how far we let the pendulum swing in any one period of time. Two, what job we're talking about really matters. Gross oversimplification. If you're a data engineer, a data scientist, they're not and you're very good at what you do, you're going to be able to almost dictate what you're going to get paid, regardless if you live in San Francisco, Boise, or where, Charlotte or Austin. Like there's a market premium to those skills versus if you're an accountant, I can hire an accountant pretty much in any city I want. So those jobs are going to be more localized to what we need. So how much of this is a national or a global talent market versus, competition for skills? The third one is that what are we doing from a career? Is this a job? Is this a task? Or how much of this is about I'm investing for this person to be with me for longer? I'm growing a capability set. And where does that fit into my compensation and labor cost model? Do I just think about the work and the output of today, or am I thinking about something in a longer term perspective?
Interesting.
I know there are other things in the chat. What I'd say about the effect on the commercial real estate market, I think the commercial real estate market is very scared right now and is also trying to be very creative about how to re-engineer space, because if the demand for space has potentially shrunk, how do we rethink about the demand for space to create new needs of collaboration, creativity, rather than doing, right? I think that's going to be the larger evolution of commercials. And I mean office building kind of space, not necessarily retail space or other restaurants and other kinds of pieces. I think there'll be a reimagining of that. And I know the big real estate companies, Steelcase, others, right, are also thinking about, okay, we're no longer going to sell millions of cubicles, but how do we create more space that with whiteboards and interaction and movable walls and all sorts of interesting things that may be out there as well.
I know Mike also had a question he wanted to ask.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Josh, for all this great information. I apologize if you mentioned this earlier and my internet was going in and out. What advice would you have for job seekers right now, particularly in the nonprofit sector where I have my career?
So, I mean, I think it's trying to think creatively. Like what I would say is this open to really look at your skills, right? The experience you've had and what are those skills, and to rethink about them or present them in not in the what was the job or what was the task, but what was the output and what were the skills, what's transferable, right? And what's the value that you bring, and really to tell the story, right? Because and I do this, I look at people's resumes and I'm like, well, what's the story you want me to read, right? Because look, in fairness also, depending on where you're applying, like a lot of resumes are now just getting scanned by machines to go find specific stuff. And that's what's spitting out to a hiring manager. Here's the stuff that we found. Go look at these. That's less true in the not-for-profit world, although it's still out there. So I think understanding the role you're applying to and thinking about the story you're trying to tell by that resume is important. The other piece I'd say is, look, the reality is, oftentimes it's the who you know, not what you know, that matters in job seeking, right? So building those networks, right, using LinkedIn and other places to look for who are those connections to help you learn more about the organization, who works there, how do you get to be known, tends to be a really important strategy.
Thank you.
So Josh, in our last minute or two, you mentioned sort of this world according to Josh, what it would look like. And I guess that's my question for you. If you had to kind of imagine what this next iteration of work will be, what are some of the things that you hope it will include? What are some of the things that you hope we are going to be leaving behind?
So I hope that and I'm going to look for some silver linings out of this. I hope that the things we've broken enable all of us to rethink about the world we actually want, right? How do we bring those values? How are we more inclusive and diverse in our workspaces and the people we get to work with? How are we more tolerant of the diversity of who's around and how they actually want to get work done? How are we tolerant of when people want to work? That like mothers want to be able to work from, God help them, 4 a.m. to 8 a.m., right? And then 8 a.m. to 12 p.m. again. Like, I don't know how when you sleep and how you be a whole person, but like trying to think about the flexibility of getting stuff done and balancing all of those kinds of pieces. I hope. Now, I also personally want to come back into a workspace again. Like, I love being home and all of those things, but I do think there is something that we have really lost about that physicality of being collaborative and creative and getting things done. And so ultimately, I think there is some reformulation. It's not, the pendulum won't swing fully one way or the other, and it will balance differently for different organizations, but it will balance in the middle of hopefully a little bit of the best of both. Still some virtual and some in person, that allows us to take the best of both and continue them forward.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being willing to have this conversation with us. It's really an interesting topic that I know will continue to evolve, and hopefully we'll get to discuss this again. And thanks to everyone for joining us. Josh, if they have questions, can they reach out to you?
Please. Yes.
Awesome.